Hi guys, my name is Karthik and I am from ExecuteAutomation.com and welcome to next section of our Advanced Automation Testing of Modern Application with C#.NET course. And in this section, we are going to talk about integration testing. Before talking about the integration testing, let's talk about the end-to-end testing that we have been talking all these days, which is nothing but the UI testing. Because as you know, UI testing is one of the end-to-end testing that you could be able to achieve. We also saw some of the usefulness of end-to-end tests and how we could able to run the whole application by spawning up the application, run the test against it in the UI and get the result back, like how the functionalities were working fine or not. But in order to run the end-to-end test, we needed the whole application infrastructure to be in place. Like the application needs to be deployed in an IaaS server or running in as a container, and the required database server, which was something used by the application, which is nothing but the SQL server, needs to be up and running as well. It should be either deployed within your local machine or it should be running as a container, and that should have a connectivity within the container itself by the networking. And similarly, all the migration of data should have been done in the database. If not, you will have some problems as well. And any other third-party services to be available for the application should be there in place as well. I mean, in this demonstration, we have not seen any third-party services itself, but if you see in your company, like in real-time example, you might be seeing there will be a lot of third-party services being used within your application. For example, if your company is using something like an address finder service from a third party, then that's going to be one of the service that your application will be using. So you might need to test that as well. If there are any payment services used within your application, then you might need to have that dependency as well so that you could test that application. So in order to test the complete end-to-end scenario, you need to even have the third-party services in place so that you could test that functionality correctly. That's about the end-to-end testing, right? That's why the name itself is called end-to-end test. Also saw that using end-to-end test, it is bit slower. I mean, we tried running a very super simple test all these days with Selenium. It was faster, but in real-time example, UIs are kind of fragile. Even though we build as better framework as possible, it might break at some point of time. And you need to have a complete infrastructure in place, and you need to have all the setups to be in place like what we are seeing over here in order to run the end-to-end test. And think about the microservice scenarios. In order to run a microservice based application, you might need to spawn at least 20 or 30 microservices to make your application testable. If not, it is going to be quite harder. And that's the problem with the end-to-end test in the modern way of doing testing. And that's why welcome to integration testing. So integration testing evaluates an app's component on a broader level than the unit test itself, because unit tests are used to test isolated software components such as individual class methods. So let's not even confuse integration test with the unit testing. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides later on about unit testing versus integration testing. But integration testing actually evaluates the application's component in a very broader level. And integration testing confirms that two or more app components work together to produce an expected result, possibly including every component required to fully process a request. So if you're going to be doing an integration testing between a payment service with your application service, then you need to just do the testing between the communication between these two services or components, like how they're actually talking and how they process a payment. Whereas you don't really have to have other infrastructure to be in place if you wanted to test that, so that you can actually do an isolated testing between your service with the third party payment service instead of having the other components to be in place, which is not quite possible while we do the end-to-end testing, because you need to have all the services to be up and running even if you're going to be doing a simple payment testing. So that's the other problem with the end-to-end test. And similarly with the unit testing, you may be testing just that individual class method rather the whole affected area. For example, the payment service itself, because that's not going to be the coverage of your unit testing. Whereas on the integration testing, you'll be doing both the component in a complete thorough fashion of testing. An integration test ensures that an app's component functions correctly at the level that includes the app's supporting infrastructure, such as the database, file systems, and networks. And ASP.NET Core supports integration testing using a unit testing framework with a test web host, which we'll be talking pretty quickly, and an in-memory test server. So this whole section is going to be something related to these two things that we are seeing over here. Well, as that said, using integration testing, we can test the individual or all the components while they work together rather worrying about the whole infrastructure to be in place, like what I was just talking about in our couple of slides earlier. And there will be some question popping up in your mind right now. Is integration testing is more like a unit testing then? Because it looks like is you are doing some isolation on the components and just these two services to be tested. Is it related to the unit testing? Is it something developer needs to write? Well, the answer for the developer thing, no, it's not developers' work. It is going to be testers' work who is going to do the integration testing, but developers will definitely help on that. Well, unit tests mostly uses the mock data or fake data, whereas integration testing does the opposite. It actually uses the actual component that the app uses in the production, but it requires more code and data processing, and it takes a bit longer time to run than unit testing, but it is really, really worth it. And it is 100 times, at least 10 times faster than the UI testing based on the type of UI testing that you are doing. And you will see the benefit of it while we talk about the integration testing execution in this particular course. Well, finally, let's talk about the application under test that we are talking about all these days, which is this guy, right? We were doing end-to-end testing starting the application's UI, which is this one, which used to talk to our API service and the database server. But now we are going to be doing an isolated testing where we are going to be splitting this app's UI, service, and database completely separate. And now we are going to be doing our test of our application in isolation for UI, database, and service. I mean, we have did the UI testing. You could do the isolated UI testing integration like component testing as well. But the databases and service part is the one which we are going to be focusing a lot over here, at least in this section. So in this section, we are going to see how we can isolate the application under test from its infrastructure and test the actual functionality. And the isolation includes the apps running in IaaS or Docker. We will be completely isolating that. And we'll also be isolating the app's backend database, because backend database is also one of the need to be there in place for our application to be up and running. We're going to see how we can isolate that and test the application without the backend database and even run that, which is also one of the better way to speed up your test execution. Focus on the testing that you're looking for instead of having the whole infrastructure in place. And similarly, the apps required services that we can test just those services with our services, like third-party services, for example, we could do that as well. So we have been talking about our application testing in the UI perspective for all these days. And you can see that we have ended up creating separate project for each and every types of testing that we could do on the UI, creating a frameworks and stuff. And starting this particular section, we are going to be talking about the integration testing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start adding a new project over here on this particular solution as well. So I'm going to add a new project. I'm going to call this as EA integration test. I'm going to choose the same XUnit test project, and I'm going to call this as EA integration test. And I'm just going to choose .NET 6, and that's it. That is the only thing which I'm going to be doing. And then I'm going to start adding the test, which is nothing but the integration testing over here. So the integration testing part which we are going to be doing is mostly on the service of the application. For example, let's say we have our application up and running, and we have our application services, which is nothing but the product API, which is responsible for fetching the data for us. And now if I wanted to see if my product API is actually giving the expected result to the consumer, which is nothing but the EA web app. So the expected behavior of this product API was something we already tested while we tried creating a new product and then verifying the product exists in the application or not from the UI perspective. But what if we wanted to do that without UI directly on the service? You may be thinking that what I'm talking about is pretty close to the API testing, but just hold tight. It's not API testing itself. It is more beyond that. I mean, while we talk about the web application factory and how we can enhance that, you'll understand what I really mean. But as of now, it feels you like it's an API testing, but it is actually not. I mean, let's first of all write the one which we mostly heard of, like how we can consume an API, and then we'll talk about the actual and then we'll start deviate from the actual concept into the integration testing concept. All right. So now what I'm going to do, let me first of all invoke or start our application to be up and running. So for doing that, I'm going to open the Windows terminal, and I'm going to .NET course of EA app, and let me just do docker compose up. And once I do that, you know that our application is going to be up and running. So if I just go localhost of 5000, you can see that our application will be running on the port number 5000. And if I just do 5001, it is going to show the UI. So the UI part is something which we are not going to be worrying about right now. So we're going to be worrying about this guy, the localhost of 5000, which is nothing but the product API. So if I try accessing this particular UI at the moment, so if I try accessing the get products right now, for example, if I just do a tryout, you can see that it is gonna give me 3 products, like 1, 2, and there is 4, something like this. And let's see if we could able to access the same thing from, and if I wanted to test this particular response over here within my test application, my test code, all I'm going to do is I need to somehow add a library method to make that happen. But instead of doing that like rest sharp or something like that, we are actually going to be using one of the inbuilt client which is available within the C# itself, which is nothing but the HTTP client. So if I just do HTTP client and if I hit control dot, you will see that it brings you up the system.net.http. I'm going to add this particular client. And we can also specify the base address of the HTTP client over here, something like this. And we can specify the new URI of the IP address, which is going to be this one. So I'm going to copy that. So probably we're going to copy this one because we also require the /product of /get products later on. But this is the base address. And once I have this, if I want to get the response, from the get products API path, then I need to first of all send a request. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do var response is equal to client dot, and there is a method called as send method. You can use async if you wanted to. I'm just going to go with non-async method at the moment. And then I'm going to say new of HTTP request message of HTTP get method. So you can see that Visual Studio 2022 is automatically completing things for me. And I'm going to say I need the path to be product / get product. So I'm just going to do that over here. That's it. So this is the only thing which I need to do at the moment. So this guy is going to actually send a get request for this particular path. I think the slash is not required because we already have a slash over here. And it is going to get all the products. And then I need to, let's say, if I just want to check if the response is correct or not. So let's say response dot, there is something called as ensure success code. So if it is HTTP okay, then this test is going to pass. So you can see that we are actually doing a very super simple test here. And I will actually show you how the test is going to look like as well. So this is EA integration test. And let me run the test. So if it is actually passing, which means the ensure success status code is actually true as well. And you can see that this has been executed and it just took like 62 milliseconds. And if I want to get all the response value, like whatever response that I wanted, we can actually put a breakpoint here. And let's say if I want to debug it, and if I just do F10, you will see that I get a response here, like whole thing, but there is no content at the moment. And what we need to do is we actually need to get the content. So what I can do, I can get the quick watch option here. And then within that, we can do this content dot, there is something called as read as string async method, where we can actually get what is the particular method returning us. And you can see that the response is actually coming up. And I can just do a result to see what is the result. And you will see that it is actually giving us the three values just coming up before: the keyboard, mouse, and the cabinet. And this is exactly the three value that we were actually seeing over here on the response body of the get products. So this is how we can actually start looking into the tests, like how we could able to do the test of that particular value using the simple get response dot content dot read async dot result method. So let me now start writing the code here, something like this. And I can probably do some sort of JSON conversion from the JSON to string, and then I can go and verify all the values over there. So I could able to do all those checks here to verify if the result is actually the one which I'm looking for. But that's not the focus of this particular section. The idea here is to show you that the most simplest, but that's not the idea of this particular video. I just wanted to show you the most simplest way that we could able to get the value over here and verify that. But the problem, but there are so many problems in this particular method at the moment. Like every time we try to perform any operation, we need to have our application up and running, either in the container or in our local machine. And then we need to have a hard-coded request, something like this, like HTTP get, and then we are passing the product slash get products, like the full path. And then we're getting a response, like a raw response. And over here, I need to do a lot of manipulation, like JSON convert or something like that, to a specific type, or maybe like a non-type string value, and then I can verify the value. Or I can just do like ensure success code, something like this. So these are some of the pain points with this particular code. But yes, it is quite classy and it works as expected. But the problem is there are some caveats in this code as well. But now you got the idea about the integrations testing, like where we are starting up, right? We are starting to test the actual service for its data that we are looking for by sending an actual request and getting the response back. In our next lecture, we will see how we can actually start getting around the problem of reading the data as something like this. But in our next lecture, we'll start discussing even better way to actually perform the integration testing.